The financial power play no one warns you about. Divorce doesn't usually begin in a courtroom. It begins in silence, in colder conversations, in smaller withdrawals, in passwords that suddenly change, in tax returns that are too complicated to explain. And by the time papers are filed, something else has already happened. The financial battlefield has been prepared. Because while divorce feels emotional on the surface, underneath it is structural. It's about leverage. It's about positioning. It's about who understands the system and who doesn't. Money in a marriage is supposed to be shared risk. But in some divorces, it becomes a weapon. Not loud, not obvious, strategic. And when it's used that way, the damage often begins long before the judge ever hears the case. The first weapon, information control. The most powerful financial advantage isn't wealth, it's knowledge. In many marriages, one partner handles the money, the investments, the business accounts, the retirement funds, the taxes, the debt structure, the credit lines. Often it feels practical. He's better with numbers. He understands investing. I trust him. And maybe you should. Until you shouldn't. When divorce becomes possible, the partner who controls financial knowledge already holds a map of the entire system. He knows where the money sits, which accounts are liquid, which ones are harder to trace, what can be moved quietly, what can be explained away. The other spouse, meanwhile, is left reacting, and reaction is always weaker than preparation. Sometimes it starts subtly. Bank statements stop arriving physically. Online logins stop working. Questions are answered vaguely. Documents are delayed. Nothing dramatic. But delay is a tactic, because while you're trying to understand what exists, he already knows what can disappear. And in divorce, time equals leverage. Income that shrinks at the perfect moment. One of the most common financial maneuvers happens when income becomes flexible. If a husband owns a business, is self-employed, earns commissions, bonuses, or performance-based pay, something interesting can happen once divorce is on the horizon. Revenue drops. Suddenly, it's a bad year. Clients disappear. Expenses increase. Profits are reinvested. Bonuses are deferred. On paper, income shrinks. And why does that matter? Because support obligations, spousal support, child support, are calculated based on income. Lower reported income means lower financial responsibility. It's not always illegal. Sometimes it's just creative timing. Business purchases get accelerated. Income gets delayed into the next fiscal cycle. Personal expenses get categorized as business costs. To the untrained eye, it looks like bad luck. To a forensic accountant, it can look like strategy. But not every spouse can afford forensic accountants, which means the numbers often go unchallenged. And numbers, once accepted, shape outcomes for years. The quiet drain. Not all financial weaponization is about hiding income. Sometimes it's about shrinking what's available. Before separation becomes official, some husbands begin moving money in ways that reduce the visible marital estate. Large investments appear. Savings accounts get thinner. Loans are repaid early. Money is temporarily transferred to relatives. Cash withdrawals increase. Nothing looks dramatic in isolation, but together, the marital pool begins to dry. And because divorce proceedings take time, months can pass before courts freeze accounts or impose financial restraints. By then, the damage is done. When resources feel unstable, fear sets in. And fear changes negotiation posture. A spouse worried about immediate survival is more likely to settle quickly, even if the settlement is uneven. Financial pressure accelerates emotional decisions, and emotional decisions are rarely strategic ones. Litigation as a weapon. Divorce is expensive, and in high-conflict cases, cost itself becomes a strategy. If one spouse controls more liquidity, he can afford to extend the fight. He can file motions repeatedly, request additional hearings, challenge minor issues, demand evaluations, dispute valuations, appeal procedural details. Each step requires legal response. Each response costs money. The goal isn't always to win every argument. It's to exhaust the other side. Over time, the financially weaker spouse begins calculating survival. How much longer can I afford this? Is fighting worth it? Should I just accept this to move on? This is not about justice. It's about endurance. And endurance often favors whoever controls the larger financial reserve. When legal warfare becomes attrition, money becomes oxygen, and the spouse who runs out of oxygen suffocates first. Debt as leverage. Assets are only half the equation. Debt can be weaponized too. Joint credit cards suddenly spike in balance. Shared loans go unpaid. Credit scores decline. New credit lines appear. In some cases, financial chaos is created intentionally, not to benefit the husband, but to destabilize the wife. Damaged credit affects housing, refinancing, future employment opportunities, financial independence. And if debt accumulation happens before formal separation, untangling liability becomes complicated. Some spouses are also pressured into signing documents during emotional moments, refinancing agreements, tax filings, debt restructures, signed under stress. Later discovered to shift liability disproportionately. Financial stress narrows cognitive bandwidth, and narrowed bandwidth makes people sign things they would question in calmer circumstances. Psychological intimidation through money. Perhaps the most underestimated weapon isn't technical, it's emotional. Statements like, "You wouldn't survive without me," "You don't understand money," "You'll regret fighting me," "I'll bury you in legal fees." These are not financial moves, they're psychological conditioning. If a wife already feels uncertain about her financial literacy, intimidation lands deeper. Confidence erodes, decision-making hesitates, fear replaces clarity. Money becomes not just leverage, but narrative. If you believe you are incapable of financial independence, you negotiate from weakness, and weakness, in divorce, costs. When parenting and money collide, in divorces involving children, financial pressure becomes even more powerful. Support payments may be delayed, custody threats may surface, private agreements may be proposed outside formal structures. The emotional vulnerability tied to children makes financial pressure more effective. When a parent fears instability for their child, they may concede financially to preserve peace. Money becomes intertwined with protection, and protection is primal, which makes it easy to manipulate. Why this works so often? Financial weaponization works for several reasons. First, divorce destabilizes emotions, and emotional instability reduces strategic thinking. Second, many marriages develop financial asymmetry slowly and quietly. One partner becomes the financial authority, the other becomes dependent, sometimes by choice, sometimes by circumstance. Third, the legal system moves slowly. Financial harm can happen quickly. Fourth, fear narrows perspective. When survival feels threatened, long-term fairness feels secondary. And finally, preparation favors the informed. The spouse who anticipated divorce, even quietly, often begins positioning months or years in advance. The other spouse begins reacting only when conflict becomes visible. Preparation always outruns reaction. The real danger. The real danger is not that every husband weaponizes money. Most don't. The danger is that financial imbalance feels harmless until conflict begins. Convenience becomes vulnerability. Trust becomes dependency. Delegation becomes disadvantage. Divorce doesn't create power dynamics, it exposes them. Money doesn't corrupt the process, it reveals who understood the system all along. The antidote: clarity. The solution is not paranoia, it's awareness. Know where accounts are, understand assets and debts, have access to documents, ask questions early, maintain literacy, even if someone else manages day-to-day finances. Financial clarity is not distrust, it is self-respect. Because in divorce, clarity protects you long before a lawyer can. And if conflict never comes, knowledge still strengthens you. Money, when shared properly, builds partnership. When hidden, it builds imbalance. When weaponized, it builds silence. And silence is where the damage begins. The goal isn't to assume the worst, it's to make sure you're never negotiating from blindness. Because divorce is not just the division of property, it's the division of power. And power, in the end, follows money. If you found this video informative, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more content. Thank you.